we getting a lot
hola,
of
Monsieur JT. Hey, ça va? very, very pleased to see you.
Oh, thanks.
Yeah. You made the connection at last.
Yeah, definitely. Finally. Yeah. How have you been?
I'm very well, thank you.
Good.
And we're still waiting for people to gather.
Yeah, that's all right.
The link looks good.
Yeah, it does.
Yeah, your picture is clear.
All right. Okay, thanks.
So today we have people from Mauritius, Cote d'Ivoire, Australia, UK, Indonesia, maybe other places also.
How long is the session?
1 hour.
1 hour, okay.
Yeah. So about 40 minutes for presentation and 20 minutes for discussion.
Right, okay. I might not stay until the end because I have another Zoom meeting starting in an hour. So
okay.
the hour I will have to take leave.
Sure. Yeah, sure. It's good to see you.
Good to see you too.
It's been interesting putting this program together. People have been very, very cooperative.
Oh, that's good.
Yeah, it hasn't been difficult finding speakers.
All right.
Yeah.
Very good.
Hello.
Hello, Papa Rudin. How are you?
How are you doing?
Alhamdulillah.
Inshallah.
Where are you?
Very good. Thank you so much. Yeah.
Where are you at the moment?
At our house and very close by to rector's house. Yeah. But
I thought you were in the mosque.
Was it?
I thought you were in the mosque. The background is
yeah. So is everything ready there? You are in your library at home, yeah? Is that correct?
That's right. Yeah, I'm at home. The speaker hasn't arrived yet.
Yeah. It looks like you are getting ready, yeah, Pak. Yeah. So I'm going to keep everything quiet here so that I can do your presentation, and we are going to follow through the talk very carefully, inshallah. Yeah. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you.
Okay.
4 o'clock already. Not many speakers. Not many.
Oh, okay.
Present.
Yeah, not yet. Yeah.
Yeah.
Ya, orang-orangnya pada belum ada. Ini kelihatan. Tasya, cepat masuk. Kasihan gulenya. Hi, hello.
Hello.
Well,
hello, Ibu Arita.
Well, maybe our rector and director cannot come to the meeting, and I will represent the director to open remark.
Okay. But our speaker hasn't arrived yet.
Yes, I know.
Yeah.
Hello.
Hello.
Hi. Have I arrived late?
Is this Kath?
This is Kathleen.
Hi. Yes.
Hello.
Hello. Good.
I see there are lots of people here already. Have I arrived too early?
Exactly on time.
Oh, good.
I gave you the wrong time, didn't I?
No, you gave me the right time.
Very good.
Self-confused.
Still not so many people yet. How many? 13.
Yeah, I think some of them are on the way now.
Yeah,
because,
I hope so.
Yeah, probably some of them are already on the way because they have just finished praying. Yeah.
Yeah.
Asar.
What's the weather like in South Australia?
What's the weather like? We're supposed to be coming towards the end of summer. The last sort of week or so has been terribly hot.
Oh, right.
Okay. Terribly hot and dry. Although there was a sprinkling of rain last night, but it wasn't great. Oh, there's Paulin. Hello, Paulin. Oh, nice to see you.
Nice to see you. How are you?
Oh, I'm very well. Really lovely to see you.
Oh, okay. Yeah. Well, you do see part of me in Adelaide every now and then, don't you? With Bruce.
Yes, well, I know that he's here every now and then. I'm just not sure he's here all the time.
Okay.
Yeah. Have you been to visit lately?
Not lately, no.
Yeah.
Maybe next year.
Oh, good. Excellent.
Yeah, with COVID, everything has been thrown up in the air.
Of course, yes. Yeah.
Okay. Faisal, should we begin? There are not many people here.
Yeah. Well, we can start. And first we ask Prof. Arita first to have a speech, and then coming to Pak Director.
Okay. So, welcome to the next Zoominar meeting in the series
Recording in progress.
Hosted by Universitas Negeri Jakarta. This is the second session during this semester, and I'm very pleased that we've got a very interesting speaker today. Each meeting, I try to tell you something interesting about Jakarta, and today I was trying to find some information, some statistics about the number of languages in Jakarta. I didn't succeed. There must be hundreds because there are 700 languages in Indonesia. But I did find some interesting information from 200 years ago when Sir Stamford Raffles was Governor General of Jakarta. And in 1817, he recorded that the population of Batavia, which is the name of Jakarta at that time, the population was 33,000 people. And he recorded that there were 21 languages. So 33,000 people, 21 languages, which means on average 1,600 people per language. So even at that time, there was linguistic superdiversity in Jakarta. So I'd like to begin by inviting the Deputy Director of the Graduate School in the Universitas Negeri Jakarta, Professor Arita. Would you like to say something?
Okay, thank you, Hairul. Good afternoon from Jakarta. Distinguished keynote speaker, resource person, Rector of UNJ, Board of Directors of Postgraduate Program at UNJ, and participants from many parts of the world. It's my great pleasure to welcome you to our monthly international program, Language Society Education 2022. What an honor to have you join us in this month's Zoominar program hosted by Postgraduate Program of UNJ. The scope of this monthly international program may cover an international level of topics, but we often link it with Indonesian contexts in the hope of obtaining insight from our international colleagues, as well as providing a discussion platform for our students here in Indonesia and those who are passionate in these topics. Our topics this March is focusing on the role of local, regional, and international languages in multilingual education to achieve equity and inclusion. Joining us now, our keynote speaker, Kathleen Hugh, from University of South Australia, Adelaide, Australia, and Hywel Coleman, an honorary senior research fellow in the School of Education, University of Leeds, UK, who will moderate the session. Once again, thank you very much for your willingness, Kathleen, to share your perspective on multilingual education. Without further ado, I wish you an insightful discussion and thank you for your attendance and participation in this month's international program. Thank you, Hywel.
Thank you, Professor Adita. So, as you've just heard, the speaker is Dr. Kathleen Hugh. I've known Kathleen for a long time, and I know she's an extremely hardworking person, takes her work very, very seriously, and is always an inspiring speaker. Before we begin, I'd like to ask you, during the presentation, can you please switch off your video and mute the sound? And then during the presentation, if you have any comments or questions, perhaps you can put them in the chat box, and then we'll have time at the end, about 20 minutes at the end of the session for discussion. Okay, Kathleen, the floor is yours. Thank you for coming.
Thank you very much. So I'd very much like to thank Hywel for inviting me to speak today, and I'm very delighted to be in Indonesia, if only in somewhat virtual form. So I'm going to try and hope that my PowerPoint works. So I hope that I'm going to show that. Does it show up? Has the screen shown up for you?
It has. Thank you.
Oh, right. So I was going to be speaking about the role of local, regional and international languages in multilingual education to achieve equality and inclusion. And I'm still going to be doing that. But notice from some of the correspondence that Hywel was mentioning that there's a little bit of ambiguity in the discussions around what mother tongue-based multilingual education is. So I thought that I would bring that into the discussion and give that some emphasis. I hope that's all right. I thought also that just before I kick off, I just mention the background that all of us are actually aware of at the moment. There's significant global movement of people as a result of conflict and displacement and changing balances of power. And that, of course, increases the diversity of student profiles in classrooms and schools in most countries of the world. Now, while this might be well known to us living and working in the global south and post-colonial countries, this is not really as well understood in global north countries. What we've become aware of is that there's a changing focus in linguistics, in the theory and thinking about many languages and literacy in learning. And this has implications for education systems, including ones that relate to transnational frameworks. Hello? Is that okay? Educational systems, including those of transnational frameworks of the United Nations and UNESCO. It's only 8 years before we reach UNESCO's Education 2030 targets for the Sustainable Development Goals, especially SDG 4. the beginning of this year, the United Nations launched the International Decade of Indigenous Languages, which runs until 2032. And one of UNESCO's key programs is the Local and Indigenous Knowledge Systems, the LINKS program. All of these things together, including the increasing diversification of classrooms, bring implications for professional learning and support of teachers. They also bring implications for how we understand and think about literacy, curriculum, pedagogy, and assessment, particularly in relation to biliteracy, mother tongue-based multilingual education, English medium instruction, translanguaging, and so forth. However, new terms and approaches may be confusing and disempowering for teachers, and linguists, whether we are applied, cognitive, educational, or sociolinguists, often talk at cross purposes for one another, and the conversations we have are not always helpful for teachers, and particularly educational authorities in low-income countries. So the outline of what I'm going to be talking about is I am going to be discussing terminology in relation to bilingual and multilingual education, in particular biliteracy, mother tongue-based, multilingual education, English medium instruction, what we used to call mixing of languages and code switching, which now we tend to bring under the rubric of translanguaging, and I'll also introduce another concept called transknowledging. I'll give a brief history of the term mother tongue-based multilingual education in the context of 120 years of research findings in sub-Saharan Africa, including a 25-country study and other longitudinal data, in the context also of learning from mistakes that we've made, successes that we've had, and also bearing in mind that this is a context in which you are experts on language education policy and have an interest in language education policy in Indonesia, and experts here are best placed to provide the most contextually relevant information. So what I can say really may be a little general, and some of it may be useful and some of it may not be as useful as you might hope. So the first thing that I'd like to say is that in the changing context of teaching, the role of languages in education needs to be clarified. We're now thinking about national official languages, minority languages, international languages of wider communication, and by this we mean English, French, Portuguese, Spanish, Putonghua, perhaps Arabic. There's an increasing shift towards notions of national language used as a medium of instruction, for example, Bahasa Indonesia, medium instruction. There's a great deal of discussion around mother tongue-based bilingual education or multilingual education, and then, of course, English medium instruction, which used to previously be very commonly used in the former Anglophone countries of Africa, or so-called Anglophone countries of Africa. In other words, those countries that had been colonized by Britain, and also in South Asia. But we see that EMI, or English medium instruction, is now moving into many countries of the Asia-Pacific countries where there was no history of British colonization. We are now beginning to realize that students are bilingually rich. Whoops, I'm so sorry. Bilingually or multilingually rich rather than language poor. And this has implications for teaching and learning. We need to be considering what we know and understand of bilingual learners and bilingual approaches to literacy, language and teaching across the whole curriculum. So what led to the term mother tongue-based bilingual or multilingual education in the African context? I mentioned a little earlier that we've had 120 years at least of reports and recommendations for language and literacy education across the continent. And these have all recommended the use of local languages, sometimes called mother tongue medium education, for at least the first 1 to 3 years, followed by a switch to English or French or Portuguese medium instruction, so which are abbreviated as EMI, FMI, or PMI. Several of these reports for the first 50 years of the 20th century were then brought together and repackaged in a UNESCO report in 1953, the report on the use of vernacular languages in education. And again, this report again recommended that the use of the mother tongue should be present in the schooling of all children in Africa for at least the first 3 years. But after independence reached countries in Africa, from the 1960s to the 1990s, most of the former Anglophone countries reduced the amount of mother tongue education, contrary to the spirit of the UNESCO report in 1953. In fact, in the Anglophone countries, the missionaries had implemented very often 4 to 6 years of mother tongue education before a transition to English medium education. So in the Anglophone countries, we saw this reduction. Some countries went to 1 year or 2 years of mother tongue education. Others went as far as 3 years in most cases. In the so-called Francophone former French colonies and Lusophone former Portuguese colonies, there was usually no mother tongue education provided at all. And I hope that Paula and Jite will correct me and add some qualifications when I finish. Now, what we found was that some years after 1953, in fact, in the next 2-3 decades, we found that very few students were staying in the schooling system to the end of primary school. So in other words, there was no retention, there were very high repeater rates, and there was very poor achievement of students across the curriculum and very low throughput to secondary education. So in other words, this early transition to a second language, particularly when the second language was one of the international languages, was not doing the students very much good. So the actual history of the term is that in South Africa, in the build-up towards bringing about the post-apartheid regime or governance of the country in the mid-1990s, quite a lot of work was done in terms of trying to research and find out what had happened elsewhere in Africa after countries had achieved independence from the colonial powers. So much of the research we found and moved towards the term mother tongue-based bilingual and multilingual education was informed by multilingual education research findings elsewhere in Africa from the 1930s onwards. We did borrow the terms additive and subtractive from bilingual education in North America. We did so in the political context that these terms were preferable to those that had been used with bilingual education during the apartheid system in South Africa. And so we started with alternative suggestions for language education policy. And they began as additive bilingual and or additive multilingual education with the home language, the mother tongue, local language as the foundation for learning, as would be necessary in the, across most countries in Africa, as would be preferable together with a national language elsewhere in Africa like Kiswahili or Amharic or Somali, or usually an international language like English, French, Portuguese, or sometimes both a national language and an international language. So we were thinking about a policy that would present additive bilingual education in that manner. So additive bilingual education was then explained as bilingual education based on the home language, otherwise known as the first language or the mother tongue, and adding a provincial or national or international language with a minimum of 2 languages for each child. Additive multilingual education was then explained as multilingual education based on the home language or the first language or the mother tongue, and a provincial or national or international language. Often English, and certainly in South Africa, English was the favored language in this case. Now, because many countries in Africa are highly multilingual, perhaps not nearly as multilingual as is Indonesia, there are nevertheless many different mother languages or mother tongues in each country. And there's always a national language. Sometimes it's English has been chosen to be this manner, and this was the case in South Africa. So what it meant in South Africa was that it would be the mother tongue, the home language, the mother tongue, and where possible also a third and even fourth language for each student. So it could be the mother tongue, a provincial language, and a national language, for example, English. And we started trying to clarify the policy of additive bilingual and multilingual education. We came to realize that most people actually understood the term mother tongue better than they did understand the home language. And that to avoid confusion with European and North American models of bilingual education, and because English had become the national language of aspiration in South Africa, the project for the study of alternative education in South Africa, based at the University of Cape Town, changed the original term back from home language to mother tongue. Now, Paulin visited us during this period when this was happening, and he might comment on this a little later. So what had been called bilingual education based on the home language and the provincial or national language then changed to become the mother tongue-based bilingual education with a minimum of 2 languages for each student. With regard to multilingual education, as we've originally framed it, based on the home language and a provincial and national language, this was changed to mother tongue-based multilingual education, MTB, MLE, as you probably are somewhat familiar with the term today. And this was intended for system-wide bilingual, trilingual education for each student in the country. But because lots of people had different home languages or mother tongues, because you're trying to manage a system with different mother tongues plus English, it meant over the system that the system was a multilingual education system. Now, I have to just draw attention to the fact that at the time that we were developing this terminology, we had no idea that anybody else in the world would use this vocabulary. And the vocabulary was developed specifically for the circumstances in South Africa at the time. And the terms we used were intended to clarify the historical and political misunderstandings in the South African context. So we didn't think that anyone else would take this terminology on. Now, it seems that our original intention might have been misunderstood in some circumstances or interpreted differently in certain places. So I'm now moving on to key findings that we've had from African and Southeast Asian and South Asian research between 1980 and 2021. What we found is that students in multilingual societies who attend formal education need a minimum of 6 years of learning how to read and write for literacy, and also using literacy for reading and writing in order to learn in the language of their home or local community, in other words, the mother tongue, the first language, and also 6 or more years of well-resourced teaching and learning of a second or third language. Now, this could be the national language or an international language, and sometimes it could be both. And it's really important that all students have opportunities to develop biliteracy. In other words, literacy in both the mother tongue or the home language and also the second language, the national language or the international language. And it's particularly important that biliteracy is developed through a process in which the capabilities of literacy are transferred from one language to the other and back again to the first language. So from first language to second or third language, and from second or third language back to the first language. In other words, literacy is reinforced through two-way transfer of reading and writing expertise and understanding the dynamics between languages and knowledge, the way knowledge changes as it moves from one language to another. So they need 6 years of learning through the home language or the mother language and 6 years of well-resourced teaching of a second language before students can actually learn through the second or the third language effectively. Now, there just isn't a shortcut on this, unfortunately. We wish there were, but there isn't. Globally, there is no reliable evidence of successful transition from the first language to a second language by the second or third grade and positive or sustainable literacy achievement to last. It is simply any literacy achievement that one sees in the first 2 or 3 years in early transition programs starts to disappear by the 4th grade onwards. This is particularly for students in low-income multilingual communities. Evaluations that claim positive long-term literacy achievement in 1 to 2 or 3 years of mother tongue education with a rapid transition to a second language have been found to be unscientific and fundamentally flawed. So there are many, many studies that we can draw attention to. The one that I'll draw attention to is the 25-country study across Africa, and this was amplified. It was originally done in 2004 to 2006, and it has been expanded and amplified in an edited version of that study with the editors Adama Wan and Christine Glanz in 2011. And this study is available from the UNESCO website and easily downloadable. My work in that report specifically looking at students' achievement in bilingual, mother tongue and bilingual programs. Many studies were also included in a volume that I edited with Tove Sknabkangas, and have also appeared in a volume by Ajit Mohanty from India, and also Kirk Person from Thailand, amongst many others. So, mother tongue-based bilingual education or multilingual education based on research in Africa, just very briefly to break down some of that research, from the 1930s to the 1940s in South Africa, we found that students in bilingual medium education had higher achievement in school exit examinations than students in single medium schools. So these students were not necessarily from low-income families, but bilingual education, bilingual medium education seems to be very valuable for all students. We found that it was likely that students who had bilingual education developed ethno-linguistic conflict. In other words, they were more likely to coexist peacefully. So students in bilingual and multilingual educational circumstances are very much more easily able to get along with one another. And so we believe this is a very good process for reducing conflict. In the 1970s in Nigeria, in the 6-year primary school project, the researchers found that students with 6 years of mother tongue medium education and also 6 years of learning English well as a second language, who were followed after the 6 years with a switch to English medium instruction, performed students who had 3 years of mother tongue medium and a switch to English in the 4th year. So in other words, students with less exposure to English were more successful by the end of 6 years in a systematic program with 6 years of mother tongue medium for most subjects of the curriculum, and only very good teaching of English as a subject in one lesson a day, those students' achievement in English was far greater than the children and students who changed to English medium instruction from the 4th year and had more English for learning across the curriculum. We found in the 1980s to 2021, about 40 years, systematic failure of early exit and early transition from the mother tongue in programs with mother tongue for 1 to 3 years, when there was a transition to either English, French, or Portuguese after that point. So there's a whole host of studies here, and this is just a few of those. So what the research in Africa from 1930 to 21 confirms is that students are likely to remain in school for more years in primary with mother tongue education plus the national language and or the international language. In other words, in mother tongue based bilingual or multilingual programs. So they're not mother tongue programs and they are not international programs or national language programs. They are both. They are bilingual programs or multilingual programs. The longer the use of mother tongue medium, the higher the student's achievement. 3 years of mother tongue education is better than none. 4 years of mother tongue education does increase students' opportunities, but it's not enough to sustain lifelong literacy. 6 years of mother tongue medium and 6 years of learning the second language increases opportunities to sustain literacy and also to reach secondary school. 8 years of mother tongue medium and 8 years of learning the second language as a subject, followed by transition to the second language in high school, offers the best chances to reach the end of secondary school successfully. We know this from the comprehensive study of different programs in Ethiopia in the mid-2000s. Children can learn to read and write in 2 orthographies and 3 languages better than in 1 or 2 languages, which is another finding we found from the Ethiopian study, which was really something that surprised us. And we also found that where students have 3 languages that they are learning in school, they might do better than if they are only learning 2. So 3 languages might be more beneficial than 2. So positive findings with mother tongue-based bilingual education and multilingual education. In Africa and South and Southeast Asia, we have found and developed multilingual pedagogies that be used in urban, rural, and remote communities that can make mother tongue-based multilingual education work well. Ones that have been developed by teachers in schools of Africa. There are 2 videos that you might be able to watch if you would like to see those. They are downloadable from YouTube, and I've got the link to one of the slides, one of the latter slides on this slides. Ones that are being developed by teachers in every Asian country across the Asia Pacific and also the Americas right now. And even teachers in Ireland have found these strategies and pedagogies to be so useful that in a school with 80 different language communities, students exit primary school with literacy in their home languages, Irish, Gaelic, French, and English. And you'll find this study in a book written by David Little and Deirdre Kirwan. I think I might have the wrong date. It might be 2018. Now, the thing about multilingual education is it's not rocket science. Teachers don't have to be rocket scientists. And very ordinary people and people who haven't been trained as teachers actually find the way to practice multilingualism in education. I'm giving you an example now of something that I discovered. She came from Sarawak, which is not very far away from Indonesia, and she was a third-year linguistics student of mine a few years ago. And Aja Wanmayuki went home and she undertook a vacation research project. And in her project, she found that multilingualism is the medium of instruction. And I'll come back to this little finding that she has in a little while. But first, I'll take you through some of the things that she found when she visited classrooms in Sarawak. She said in one classroom, the teacher uses Arabic, Bahasa Malaysia, and Bahasa Sarawak. By practicing multilingualism as the medium of instruction, the students will be able to understand and pay more attention in their learning lesson. In another classroom, in a different part of Sarawak, she found dual language, which is Bahasa Malaysia and Bahasa Iban, can be found in one of the rural area schools of Sarawak. 3 participant interviews were from different ethno-linguistic communities, from Iban, Malay, and Melano. Respondents think that the usage of more than one language is one of the best ways to develop their student language repertoire. All respondents stated that they enjoy being multilingual, and it somehow helps a lot in their career development. Being multilingual, it will ensure that the language proficiency among people in workplace, school, and among society. Now, Isa's observation was that usage of more than one language in school and on the signboards in public areas in Sarawak indicated to her that there is a usage of other languages rather than only the national language in order to accommodate every speech community in Sarawak. I think she was being a little optimistic, but that is how she felt about it. And she concluded her research with a recommendation. Multilingualism and cultural diversity in Sarawak should be maintained in order to preserve the identity of its people and their nation. Now, I was absolutely amazed when Isa, was just a third-year student, never been out teaching herself, not gone through any teaching training program, made these observations by simply going into classrooms where she was given permission and making little observations. But what struck me as absolutely astonishing was that she created this term, multilingualism is the medium of instruction. Now, I have been working in multilingual education my entire adult life, and I wish I had thought of that term, but it wasn't me, it was one of my students, and she was from Sarawak. And so I'm incredibly proud of that. I think it's just astonishing. I said a little while ago that anybody can be a teacher and work multilingually, and one doesn't have to be a rocket scientist. And I came across an example of a very young woman in a slum area on the outskirts of Bhopal a few years ago. And I found this young woman, Chandni, who'd not had herself gone to a completed school and was working with out-of-school children, because these children were from a very minoritized tribal community, the Gondi community. And they were known as a tribe of criminals. It was a terrible way of identifying this group of children. And they weren't allowed to go to the normal school. So she was working in a small community-based organization trying to keep the children off the streets and trying to teach them. And what I found that she was doing, she had decided herself that she could not teach these children Hindi unless she taught them to read and write in Gondi. So what she did was, she went to the internet and she translated some information off the internet first into Hindi and then into Gondi. And she wrote bilingual texts, and she pasted them onto paper, and she then laminated the paper and she put them into a ring-bound book that she made. And she produced a bilingual literacy resource for her students. the thing that I found astonishing was that no one had ever spoken to her about bilingual education. No one had ever given her any ideas of pedagogies to work with bilingual children, but she had done this entirely on her own. So the point that I'm really trying to make is that very often teachers know what they need to do, if only we will allow them the latitude and the flexibility to do this. So I'm coming to a new point, a related point about mother tongue-based multilingual education now. We know that biliteracy and triliteracy is extremely important in relation to multilingual education. And we also know that when we are working with multilingual education, we need to be very purposeful with the pedagogies that we use. And I'm now going to introduce the terms translanguaging and transknowledging as I understand it from the work that I have observed teachers working with in schools in remote areas of many different countries of Africa and also in India. Translating knowledge from one language to another involves knowledge, language, and literacy. Knowledge developed in one language may not be known in another language. And two-way exchanges of knowledge between the community and the school are important, and also between the school and the community. So it's not just knowledge from the school to the community, it's from the community to the school and the school to the community. And these exchanges of knowledge involve transknowledging, because the kind of knowledge we have outside of the school somehow or other has to be translated so that it is useful in the school setting. And what we learn in the school setting also has to be translated into what is useful in the community. So knowledge has to be translated, and we might call this transknowledging. Now, there's this other term, translanguaging and biliteracy. And together, what these mean is we need to learn to hear, to read, to understand, to exchange knowledges of the community and the world. Multilingual pedagogies that have evolved in Africa and the Asia Pacific for thousands of years include both the mixing of languages and the separation of languages for specific purposes. Translanguaging, which includes mixing of languages, code switching, translating, and interpreting, is beneficial if we use this both when we are speaking and writing, and when both speaking and writing are included as a pedagogical approach to multilingual education in the classroom. So it's important that mixing, code mixing, translating, interpreting is included, and if the goal is strong capability in both the home or local or mother language on the one hand, and also at least one language of power, which might be the national language or it might be an international language. So translanguaging is beneficial, but only if it's used both in speaking and writing, and only if the goal is strong capability in two languages, or at least two languages. Because access to higher education, future careers and employment, and community well-being is dependent on strong capability in two languages. So mother tongue-based multilingual education using purposeful spoken and written translanguaging and transknowledging empowers and delivers social justice to students in post-colonial and low-income countries.
Kathleen, can we finish in a few minutes?
So we can stop right now.
No, it's okay. Just carry on. But
well, Lucy, the thing is that I can leave the slides with you. They're just a number of false claims and things that maybe will come up in discussion. They don't have to be dealt with here. So I've got just a slide on the slide. The next slide will be just some resources, YouTube video resources that people might be able to go and access if they like. And otherwise, this would be my last slide. So it's up to you.
No, carry on.
All right. So there are myths and efforts are often used to avoid mother tongue-based bilingual or mother tongue-based multilingual education. So many people put out false claims to try to deflect education authorities and teachers from implementing multilingual education. So these are some of the false claims. One of the ones that is circulating quite widely at the moment is the term mother tongue is outdated and it's not valid. Well, the reality is that the term is used quite widely across Africa, Southeast Asia, and South Asia. So if people and communities use the term widely, then the people decide whether it is valid, not the experts. Another claim is that people don't know what their mother tongue is. They mix their languages, therefore just give them the international language. It's a waste of time giving them the mother tongue. Well, the mother tongue is the language that children use. Whether this is a standard language, whether it is a variety, whether it is a so-called dialect, or whether it is a mixing of languages, code mixing or translanguaging, that is the mother tongue. Mother tongue, the term, is often regarded as being a literal term. In other words, it's the tongue of the mother. Well, of course, we all know it's not the mother's tongue. It's not really meant to be taken literally. And it's also often suggested that it discriminates against men or transgender people. Well, the mother tongue is the language used by the father, the mother, the family members. This is the mother tongue. And the term is used in a figurative sense. It's not meant to be understood as a literal thing. So another claim is that mother tongue-based bilingual education or multilingual education does not offer students adequate access to the international language. Well, that's not true. Bilingual and multilingual education always offers access to the international language or the national language, but some approaches are better than others. There is often a confusion of meaning. Some critics misunderstand terms or they misuse them, and this does cause confusion for parents, teachers, and educational officials. But what I can say is that mother tongue-based bilingual education and multilingual education offers the best approach we know, and it is supported by considerable and reliable evidence. And so thank you very much for your patience, and I hope you'll ask lots of questions, and hopefully people will correct me where I have been wrong.
Thanks very much, Kathleen. It's a really interesting presentation, lots and lots of research findings, which are fascinating. And a lot of this is very relevant for Indonesia, for the situation in Indonesia. One of the challenges that we face here is sometimes a negative perception of languages that are not the national language. It's almost as though there's a taboo about using local languages in education. So this is one of the challenges that has to be overcome. I'm sure there are lots of other comments and questions. I can see Musna from Mauritius would like to ask a question. Hello, Musna?
Yep.
Yeah, go on.
Hello, Dr. Hugh. We met in 1999 in Réunion Island. So it's nice to see you again after 25 years.
Goodness me. Hello.
My question is, and I wrote it in the chat, it seems that it is the norm, that translanguaging is a norm, and that would be the norm in most multilingual contexts and classrooms. Like for us people in Mauritius and other countries of the world that are multilingual, this is something that is nothing surprising. So my question is it not our role as linguists and maybe language teachers to emphasize the quality of education in each of these languages in order to help our students access university and education jobs? Because my concern is that the overemphasis on the benefits of translanguaging is removing attention from the importance of quality language teaching. So that's my question. Thank you very much.
I'm so glad you asked that question, Mirza. Thank you. So perhaps I should have just made it a little bit more clear. I think there are at least two different kinds of discussions around translanguaging. The one I think is a very weak one, and the other is a much stronger one. So I was emphasizing that as long as the goal is high-level capability in two languages, the mother tongue or the first language and the second language, if that is the national language or the international language, the language of power, we have a responsibility to make sure, in the interests of equality and social justice, that the students that go through our hands are able to enter higher education if they possibly can, and have possibilities to fulfill their aspirations for their careers and employment, and so on. The weak form of translanguaging only focuses on conversational, informal translanguaging, and it is linked to a notion that there are no boundaries between languages. There are boundaries between languages, and unless we show the students where these boundaries between the languages are, we are doing them an injustice. It may be okay in the United States. It may be okay in the United Kingdom. It is not okay in low-income countries. We have to show our students where the boundaries between the languages are. We encourage spoken translanguaging and fluid mixing practices, but they won't get into university with those. They need strong capability in both languages. I hope that's...
Yep, that's very clear, and that answers my question, because my concern has been the other version of translanguaging. Thank you very much, Dr. Hugh.
Thank you. Thank you. I'm so glad you asked that question.
There's a question from Bapak Sudarwo, a fundamental question in Indonesia. Bapak Sudarwo. Hello?
Okay.
Would you like to ask your question, Sudarwan? Oh, I'll read it for him. So for the context of developing countries, what do you think the potential similarity is that we can identify between South Africa, the South African experience, and Indonesia in terms of mother tongue-based education? Do you think it should be encouraged for students in Indonesia to practice multilingualism?
Look, I don't really understand the multilingual ecology in Indonesia very well. My understanding, though, is that Indonesia is a highly multilingual society. So that means that people will be practicing their multilingualism. They will be growing up in multilingual communities. Most people, I assume, will be growing up in circumstances where they use one language for one purpose. Perhaps they use one language for reasons of faith. Perhaps they use another language when they go to the market. They might use another language when they go to meet, to have appointments for job interviews and so on. So everybody in a highly multilingual society needs to be able to operate in several languages. So the degree of multilingualism in South Africa is not nearly as extensive as I understand it to be in Indonesia. However, it may also be the case that in people's daily lives, they really can get by with 3 languages. Very often in multilingual societies, one might be able to get by with 3 languages. But I think it's highly unlikely that and please correct me if I'm wrong, my guess is that you would need at least 3 languages in Indonesia. I don't know if that answered the question.
Yeah, you're quite right. But then the challenge is, what are the implications for education? And what are the implications for education?
So the implications for education would be, I think, that one tries to ensure that there's teacher education that allows for circumstances where communities of children who speak similar languages, the local languages, are in classrooms where that language is privileged and taught. And the students are taught the national language, Bahasa Indonesia. And if it's necessary also for them to have a 3rd language like English, that is also provided for them in the school. Now, I also think it's highly likely in the urban areas that there will be children from many different language backgrounds in the same classroom. Is that the case? So I'm asking if it is, the classrooms will be very multilingual in urban settings.
Yeah, you're right.
So there we would have, we would probably have to go with a situation where the classroom pedagogy is multilingual friendly, so that there would probably have to be a main language of the classroom. I guess that this is going to be Bahasa Indonesia, but perhaps the teachers would trained to be sufficiently sensitive to the other languages that the children bring into the classroom, and to create opportunities for those children to use those languages and to translate back and forth between their home languages and Bahasa Indonesia, so that they are involved in that kind of process where they are understanding, they're developing their knowledge, they are checking that they understand things, understanding the content of the lesson by using multilingual pedagogies. So we do have those pedagogies, and we have many of those pedagogies that would be able to be used in those circumstances. So it's about trying to manage what the conditions, the local conditions are in urban areas as opposed to rural areas and remote areas of a country. I think, it's very difficult to try and cover all of these things in a short time, but I would like to say that that's a really important question. But there's always a solution.
Thanks. It's a very, very positive, optimistic answer. Any more questions or comments? I think Paulin had to leave us. He had another meeting. So
okay.
Any more questions?
I'm still here. I'm following, but I don't have a question.
Did you say you do have a question?
No, I don't.
Oh, okay.
I'm just following. Yeah.
Okay, thanks. Kathleen, I was wondering if you could say a bit more about transknowledging, because this is a term that is people are probably less familiar with it. Could you give us some concrete examples of what transknowledging?
Yes. It struck me that in the context in which I was teaching, for instance, I'll give you an example from isiXhosa people living in the eastern coast of southern Africa. isiXhosa speaking people have many names for cows, for cattle. But in English, we have very few words for cows and cattle. And you can't translate from isiXhosa into English very easily because we just don't have the words in English. So isiXhosa is, if you like, language rich in certain areas, for certain things. So, but when we translate colors like blue and green, which are in English, they don't translate well in isiXhosa because in isiXhosa they have the same word for blue and green. And I understand that this is something similar in several other languages as well, elsewhere. So very often we don't have equivalences from the one language to the other. So sometimes we have to be translating these differences when we're trying to explain meanings from one language to the other. So that's one example of knowledging. Another example is that there's knowledge that people have from long ago, and even perhaps knowledge that people are creating from one particular part of the world in a particular community that is simply just not known in another place altogether. So also people who live up in the Arctic Circle have many words for explaining different qualities of snow and ice. If we're speaking about snow and ice in English, we have very few words for this. But people living up there have to know the different stages of snow and ice because their lives depend on it. And that is something that they have acquired as knowledge, essential knowledge of the environment. In the desert communities of Australia, people have knowledge of all sorts of things that happen when the wind comes in a particular way that people know that 3 days down the line there's going to be a flood, for example. Or if you are in the deserts of the Kalahari Desert in Southern Africa, trackers will be able to tell you what time of day a lion passed by, because they will look at the footprint in the sand and they will be able to see what little insects or what creatures have walked over those footprints in the sand. And they will know if those insects came out at night or that they were daytime insects. So people would be able to read the footprint in the sand. That is knowledge. Now, how do you translate that in a language like Tsakani into English? Now, people in English that I know don't know anything about that, but people who speak Tsakani do know that. So that is knowledge. So we miss so much if we don't knowledge, we don't translate the knowledge. So language and multilingualism and bilingualism is not just about the language. It's about how we access knowledge from other people who know so much more than we do in that other language. What do we miss when we don't learn other people's languages? So language and knowledge go together. They're two sides of the same coin. We sometimes look at the language and the reason we need to be speaking with people in different languages is we also need to share knowledge.
Good, thanks. That's very useful. I can see two more questions, one from Bapak Budiarto, one from Professor Arita. So if we can have those two questions, and I think that will probably be enough. Budiarto, would you like to ask your question?
Okay, thank you. Yeah. So my main question is, how is it possible for Indonesian learners? Because as you know, you mentioned earlier that there should be strong capabilities in both written and oral or speaking. But in fact, in Indonesian, it is difficult to find such setting. Okay, that is the first one. The second one is the interference, while translating, and then how do you cope with that situation? Because there is a theory, in contrastive analysis, that translation can be negative interference. Okay. How do you cope with such situation? Thank you. I think that's my main question.
Okay, so if I'm understanding you, you are interested or concerned about interference between one language and another?
Yes. So,
particularly to do with translation, that translating might interfere with the learning of another language, or that the process of learning one language and learning another may involve language interference. Is that your concern?
Yes, that's my concern. That's right.
Oh, so there have been people who have focused on what they call interference between languages when languages. There are other people who consider the learning of languages to be a process, so that when we learn one language and we learn another, there is a process that we go through when learning one language, learning a second language, and learning a third language. We won't get it right immediately. But the whole process of translating back and forth helps us to start separating the languages and to pull them apart. So it's very often things that have been regarded as examples of language interference. And I was probably one of those people, because I went to a bilingual school and sometimes I spoke Afrikaans to children, and then people said that Afrikaans was interfering with my English, and then my English was interfering with my Afrikaans. And sometimes my spelling is a little bit odd because maybe I'm mixing my languages up. But I've come to realize that that is not language interference. It's just that you're working with 2 or 3 languages and they do interfere, they do connect, they intermingle. But as we become bilingual and multilingual, it doesn't really matter. It only really matters when we are writing for an academic purpose. Sometimes I can't think of a word in English, and so I will use another language that I have because it sounds better in that language or it's funnier in that language. But it's just because, my brain isn't just in one language space. So it could be that somebody might listen to me and think that I'm exhibiting examples of language interference. My feeling is it's not interference. It's just that we are multilingual people. And that's what happens. We mix languages. And we do learn how to pull them apart over time.
Yeah, thanks, Kathleen. Last question from Ibu Arita.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Hailo. I would like to ask about the use of mother tongue in early childhood classroom was effective in fostering children's learning abilities. Is there any variation of this result linked to the socioeconomic status of the language and the learners? Because maybe family socioeconomic status is associated with the language development in multiple domains throughout the childhood. Maybe the children from lower socioeconomic status homes show lower levels of language and communicative skills than children from higher socioeconomic status. What do you think?
I think that my understanding is that there's so many studies that have been undertaken in relation to the effect of socioeconomic status on children's language development and their development and achievements in schools. There's no doubt that children who come from middle-class homes with professional parents and whose parents read books, and where there are books in the home, children from those homes are likely to do far better in school than children from poor homes where there are no books, where the parents do not read and write or do not have the capability of reading and writing. There's no disagreement about that. There will always be a difference. But even so, if we are trying to work towards equality, what we do know is you can only learn if you can understand. You cannot learn if you do not understand. So if we have little children from a minority language background in a classroom and they do not understand what the teacher is saying, there's nothing that they can learn, or there's very little that they can learn. And those children will leave school eventually and they will not have learned. And I think that the issue is that we're in a context where we're trying to meet the agenda, 2030 agenda, having every child in school experiencing quality education. And that must mean that we teach children in the languages that they understand, and they understand the language of their community. It may be that in their community they speak several languages, but there's likely to be a common language that the children will know, and one might be able to teach them to read and write in that language. Now, I've seen this happening in tiny villages that have just come out of a 30-year period of conflict or war on the borders between South Sudan and Uganda. And the teachers don't have anything except a blackboard and a piece of chalk. And the children do learn to read. And they learn to read and write in their local language and also in English. Because the teachers put everything up on the board, in the chalk on the board, and the children have little pieces of slate. And sometimes they sit under the mango tree and they have a little stick, and the sand is smoothed out, and they write in the sand with their little stick because they don't have pencils and paper. So there are things that we can always do to make sure that children can learn to read and write.
Okay.
To do this.
Okay, thanks. I suggested that this should be the last question, but I can see that Ibu Winda has put her hand up. Can you make it a very short question, please? Very quickly.
Okay, thank you, Prof. Hywell. Dear Prof. Kathleen, it's a very interesting to hear your presentation because it gives me a lot of knowledge about the multilingual in education. So I have to catch for discuss with you. I'm a teacher. I'm a lecturer. I teach English for my students, but I don't teach English for my children at home because not everyone around him understand about the English. But different with my nephew from the child, he study at school, international school, and it's using bilingual English and Indonesian. So when he come to my home, he looks so funny because when he say that good morning everyone, are you okay? May I sit here? No one can answer his question except me because they don't understand about what my nephew says. So my question is there any significant correlation between children development and his second language acquisition? Thank you, Mrs. Kathleen.
I'm not sure if I'm going to answer you exactly as you would like me to. What we do know is that children who develop strong bilingualism, bilingual education, do develop very well and quite rapidly, but you start to see the differences from about the 6th year of school. Basically, if children start school at round about age 5 or 6, you will start to see the differences when the children are around about 11 or 12 years old. And from that point onwards, children who have strong bilingual capabilities tend to do better than children who are only schooled in one language. And this happens all over the world. So we see that they start showing that improvement and a higher degree of capability from about that point onwards. But we do know that bilingual children tend to achieve more highly overall than monolingual children. In terms of when you start bilingual education with children, I believe you start as soon as possible if you want your children to be bilingual. That's my belief. I started my children with 3 languages from the word go.
3 languages.
3.
Okay. Okay. It's understood. But the action.
I think time is up now. It's 10 past the hour already. Sorry. So I'd like to thank
Kathleen.
Thank you,
Prof. Kathleen.
Okay, Kathleen, I'd like to thank you very much for your very stimulating talk. I think we need about 4 hours to discuss the issues that you've raised. I see that 100 people have been attending and from at least 5 different countries. There are people here from Mauritius, Cote d'Ivoire, UK, Australia, and India, at least maybe other countries as well. It's been a very good. Next month's session, we'll be back in Australia for the 3rd time this semester with Obaid Hamid from Queensland. He'll be talking to us. Thanks again to everyone for participating. Thanks to the authorities in Universitas Negeri Jakarta for hosting the event, and thanks again to Catherine. Okay, goodbye until next month.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you, Hairul.
everybody.
Thank you,
Bye-bye.
Catherine.
Bye. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Recording stop.